everyone. So the point of today is I want to show you 4 different essays so that you can actually see the difference between an essay that is poorly written and an essay that is written well. I have written all 4 essays, and I purposely tried to do things in each essay that would show you very clearly the difference between of quality between the essays. One of the things I find that is tricky is that so often students will ask teachers, how do I know what is a good essay and what is a bad essay? And the problem is that we don't always have examples to show students. It's just kind of, we say, well, yeah, the essay should have this, the essay should have that. And unfortunately, it's not clear enough for students. They need to actually see the difference between a good essay and a bad essay. I always like comparing things to sports. I don't know why. I don't like sports. But you can tell the difference between a soccer game played between 5-year-olds, and then you can see a soccer game played between 18-year-olds, and then a soccer game played by professionals. Students need to be able to see the actual difference. So that's what today is all about, is I'm just simply going to show you 4 different essays, all written on the same thing. And hopefully it'll be kind of clear afterwards. Another thing I find is that my students will say, what else do I need to work on to get better at my essays? And sometimes I'll say, well, transitions. But then what happens is then I get another essay from them and there's like a million transitions, but the content isn't really there. Or they'll say, what else do I need to work on? And I'll say, well, maybe, try and use a little bit of a richer vocabulary. And then they have amazing words, but then the content is not there and then there's no transitions. So instead of going piece by piece and looking at the finicky little details, I want to just show you overall so you can see and appreciate, okay, that's the difference in the feel between 4 different kinds of essays. So here we go. This is what we're doing. What we're going to do is we're going to read 4 different essays on the 3 blind mice. And again, it's just 4 different takes on what the theme could possibly be of the 3 blind mice. The first time I did this activity with my students, I didn't know that some of them had never read the 3 blind mice. So here we are. I'm just going to read this to you so that you know what it is before we start reading some essays on it. So here we go. This is the poem, The 3 Blind Mice. So 3 blind mice, 3 blind mice, see how they run, see how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife, who cut off their tails with a carving knife. Did you ever see such a sight in your life as 3 blind mice? Now, again, on the surface, I'm sure, and not even deeply, profoundly, I'm sure it's just simply talking about mice. I'm sure it's just a silly little song. But again, we're going to assume that maybe there's a deeper meaning with our essay analysis. So I'm now going to read you the first essay. Okay, as you can see right away, this essay is very short. Normally, essays are supposed to have multiple body paragraphs. So typically we see an introduction, we see a conclusion, and 3 body paragraphs. Now that doesn't mean that you just take a paragraph and chop it into 5 bits. Visually, yes, it might look better. But we can see right away visually this essay is very, very short. So unless it were written incredibly, incredibly well, it's just simply not going to say enough. There might be the beginning of quality, but you're just not going to have the depth of analysis that you need. So even right away, just simply how tiny it is gives us an indication that that whoever the writer is, like it was me, I wrote it, but whoever the writer is, they don't really know what they're talking about. So I'm just going to read this out. You guys can follow along and watch with me. So, and again, let's say I were rating the essays out of 4, I would maybe give this one a 1 out of 4. And who knows, maybe your teachers have different scales, they're harder markers, I don't know. To me, there's something here though, so it's not a 0, but probably maybe a 1. It's just a beginning essay. So here we go. My essay is going to talk about the poem, The 3 Blind Mice. This poem is about 3 blind mice, and I know it because that is what the title says. It actually says the title in the very first line, and it says it again in the first line. It also says it again in the last line. So basically, most of the poem is the line 3 blind mice. It would probably be hard to be a blind mice because how would you find food and stuff? The theme of the poem is blind mice. It's obvious that it's the theme because they talk about it so much. It repeats a lot. This is repetition. When it says all the time 3 blind mice, I know that it's repetition because it says it over and over and over. I like the poem a lot because I like animals. Not so much mice, but I do like animals. There's also a wife who's cutting up the mice. That part's not very good because it's abuse. And what did the mice do to the old lady anyways? I wouldn't ever go after a mouse, especially not a blind mouse. The mice do a lot of running, and I know that because it says that the mice are running. I don't know if they got away or not, but they're blind, so probably they didn't. But yeah, like I was saying, the theme is blindness. The mice are blind. The old lady might be blind, but probably not because she has a knife, and it would be really hard to chase after a living mouse with a knife if you're blind. Overall, I like this poem, but parts of it no. It's about blind mice. So we're going to just do a teeny tiny analysis here of this essay. Some of the problems with it and some of the good things with it. So some of the problems are the grammar is really, really bad. There's almost no punctuation. There's hardly any organization. And hopefully it sounded to you like somebody was just talking. It didn't really sound like a clearly analyzed, coherent analysis. It just sounded more like a verbal opinion. Some of the things that worked is they actually did mention a literary device. They talked about repetition. That's really great. They had examples, and they did stick to the poem. They analyzed the poem. It just was a very superficial, or even just, you can say, a young interpretation of the poem. But hopefully you guys can relate to this and be like, okay, yeah, I see that. I get it. It's not great. It's not terrible. No, it is terrible. It's not non-existent, but it's terrible. Okay. We're going to carry on to the next one. This essay I would probably give maybe a 2 out of 4. And again, I'm looking at a high school essay, maybe about a grade 10 level, maybe 11. This essay would give a 2 out of 4. There's, as you can see already, it's longer. There's some organization. Like it looks, I haven't even read it yet, even though I wrote it, who cares? It looks like there's an introduction. It looks like there's a conclusion. And we have it looks like 2 different body paragraphs in the middle. We'll have to wait until we read it to find out. So here we are. I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll do a teeny tiny analysis after. So this essay is going to talk about the poem, The Three Blind Mice. It's not a very long poem, but there's a lot to say about it. I'm going to interpret the poem and talk about the meaning of what is in the poem. I'm going to talk about theme and symbols. In the poem, The Three Blind Mice, there's a theme. The theme is death. The theme of death is really easy to see because it's a poem about a woman who's trying to kill some mice. Although she doesn't actually kill them in the poem, she's trying to, but only manages to cut off their tails. The theme of death is also shown in the poem because the mice are running after the farmer's wife. Perhaps not, but perhaps they were trying to kill her. So the theme of death is shown both ways. In the poem, there's also a lot of symbolism. The fact that the mice are running is symbolic of their fight, and that they don't want to die, the theme. Most people, generally speaking, don't want to die, so it makes sense that the mice are running away from death. It's interesting to note, though, that the only people doing the running are the mice, and not the farmer's wife. The poem doesn't even mention her running, it just says that she cuts off their tails. Because of this, it looks like the farmer's wife is death, as she doesn't have to run to kill, she can just stay where she is. This shows that running is really symbolic because it shows that sometimes you have to run away from death to not die, but that death doesn't always have to run after you to kill. This essay talked about the theme, death, and symbolism, running and death. The poem talked about how the theme was shown in the poem and how the symbols were connected to the theme. So hopefully you guys can see that this is substantially better than the first one. This one, there is organization. They talk about literary devices such as, what do we have? The symbolism, and there was something else. Oh, and theme. Well, they talk about theme. There's organization, there's an introduction, there's a conclusion. Some of the things that don't work about this, maybe you wouldn't notice this right away, is it's very, it's direct in a way that is kind of still young, where it says, this essay talked about, this essay is talking about, this essay says. It's not really done with a lot of style. It's not really accomplished with a lot of fancy words. Some of the strength, though, is that it's actually very clear. Like you can follow along and be like, okay, yeah, I get what they're saying. There's lots of examples. There's not a lot of incredibly effective transition words. So it's it might be hard to pinpoint what is better or not better than the first essay, but hopefully you can feel that it just feels significantly better. So we're done with this one. Let's move on to an essay that I would maybe give a 3 out of 4 on. Okay, so with this one, the one that I would give a 3 out of 4, it's actually a 2-page one, so I'm going to have to show you the next screen capture in just a minute. But generally that's a pretty good indication that it's going to be a better poem if there's more content, more quality. So we'll do the analysis after. Here we go. This essay will discuss the poem The Three Blind Mice. This essay will examine how the theme of death is portrayed through the use of symbolism, literary devices, and form. All lives begin and end, but not all lives are taken from us with such violence and anger. The theme of death in the poem The Three Blind Mice is portrayed overtly and subtly. The theme of death is present throughout the entire poem. The symbolism used in the poem is used well and accurately. One of the more important symbols used in the poem is the symbol of the tail, line 4, who cut off their tails with a carving knife. The tail is a symbol of death, as often a tail is necessary for survival. A tamarin without a tail has less of an ability to defend itself and protect itself, as therefore reminds us that a tail is a symbol of survival. Also, felines use their tails as a way to concentrate and eliminate stress when focusing on a task. Canines use their tails to communicate. Without these abilities, it would potentially mean death to the animal. By using the symbol of the tail, the poem is being very clear about the theme of death because they're providing an image for us to better connect with, to appreciate the theme of death. The theme of death in the poem, The Three Blind Mice, is also shown through the use of literary devices. One of the more noticeable literary devices used is repetition. The poem begins and ends with the idea of three blind mice. Because they're blind, they are going to have a hard time surviving in a world with a woman with a knife. They're probably going to get hurt more easily if they encounter a cat. Repetition as a literary device is powerful in terms of communicating the theme. By repeating the horrible situation of the mice, being prey and being blind, the person who reads the poem is going to understand the theme of death better. The theme of death in the poem, The Three Blind Mice, is also shown through the use of form. The poem is very short, and this is also symbolic of death. A short poem equals death, whereas a longer poem would be symbolic of life. Even the last line of the poem is symbolic of death, because the last line is the shortest line in the poem. It is symbolic of death, as it reads, as three blind mice, line 6. We know that it symbolizes death because it feels as though the line has been cut short, similar to the lives of the mice. The mice are most likely going to die because if they weren't, then the line would probably be longer. This shows us that the theme of death is everywhere in the poem, even in how the form symbolizes the theme. In conclusion, the poem, The Three Blind Mice, had the theme of death, and it was shown through the use of symbolism, literary devices, and form. Unfortunately for the mice, they probably die at the end, thus completing the theme of death. So, as you guys can see, a significantly longer essay than the first one that I showed you. This one had way more organization. It had better transition words like saying in conclusion or therefore, that kind of stuff. It had excellent punctuation. It had examples in quotation and referencing the line that we found them on. And the ideas tied together. However, I would still say it's not a very profound essay. Like it's getting there. It's just not totally there yet. I think what might be challenging is seeing the difference between an essay that I would give a 3 and an essay that maybe I would give a 4. However, hopefully it should be pretty clear to you that this one is better than the first one, significantly, and is better than the last one that I showed you. So let's now carry on and read the final essay. Okay, so with this essay that I would give a 4 out of 4 on, it's a longer essay. It's actually, I'm going to show you 3 different screen captures here of this essay. It's going deeper than the last one because oftentimes with essays, you want to present something unique because clearly, let me just back up. In the first few essays, all 3 of the first essays said that the theme is death. And it kind of makes sense because it's look how the farmer's wife is going to cut up some mice. Like that's kind of a given. So typically when people want you to interpret something, it's exciting when you find something that's just a little bit different, maybe a little bit deeper, maybe a little bit more out there. It can't be silly. It can't be unrealistic. And we make it realistic by supporting it with examples. So while this one says that the theme is death, it's going to go a level deeper and say that on the surface it's one thing, but it's actually, it feels like it's really talking about something else. And you feel free to agree or disagree, but at least there's stylistically, there's more going on with this essay than there was in the last 3. So here we are. I'm just going to read this to you and we'll talk about it after. So Every life has potential and purpose, but sometimes those possibilities are cut short by the intentionally evil and harmful wrongdoings of men. The poem, The Three Blind Mice, can be interpreted as an extended metaphor for the struggles and hardships endured by African Americans during the slave era in the United States. While on the surface the poem seems to merely present the struggles felt by mice towards the farmer's wife, the individuals in the poem represent a much greater historical struggle: racial segregation, subjugation, and servitude. The poem indirectly discusses the theme of slavery through the use of literary devices, symbolism, and form. Struggle is a constant and persistent element of existence. While the form and delivery of the struggle may change, the presence of conflict is something which repeats throughout eternity. Repetition is a literary device which is not only present in the poem, but helps to subtly reinforce the theme of slavery, lines 1, 2, and 6. He who is born a slave dies a slave. There is no escape from the vicious cycle which continually repeats itself across generations and time. By using the literary device of repetition, the poet was able to subtly remind us, the reader, that those who are born as mice will die as mice, and generations of mice will continue to be persecuted. As repetition is a continual act, the implied meaning is that slavery is also a continual act and state of being. When the line "three blind mice" repeats, the reader immediately envisions the image of a persecuted victim. We can only assume that the three mice were not originally blind, but rather were blinded by the master of the house. Perhaps the blinding, or the symbolic injuring of the mice, was also a repeated act. Moreover, the repeated blindness of the mice is accentuated by the reoccurring request within the poem, "See how they run," line 2, and "Have you ever seen," line 5. As such, the audience is placed in a position of power whereby the reader is able to see and the mice are not. Not only has a power imbalance been created between the mice and the farmer's wife, but now, as the reader, we've been asked thrice to complete an act which the mice are incapable of. The poem subtly presents a parallel between the idea of eternal repetition and the concept of slavery. The poet helps us make the connection between the content and the delivery, and to understand that slavery is a seemingly unending cycle. Many things hint at this cycle, and it is through these symbols that we can better appreciate the way in which slavery is symbolized throughout this poem. Symbolism is a very powerful and effective way to convey information in a more stylistic and poetic manner. In the poem, The Three Blind Mice, one of the more poignant examples of symbolism is the use of the word knife, line 4. A weapon symbolizes power, violence, and separation. Although on the surface it appears as though the knife is cutting off an unessential body part, the act of cutting signifies a far greater atrocity. By employing the knife, the farmer's wife retains all power and is at liberty to treat the mice how she sees fit. Ultimately, the farmer's wife has complete control over the mice, and helpless victim mice at that. The farmer's wife in this poem represents the white slave owners, and the blind mice represent the repressed and victimized African American slaves. This symbolic connection is made clearer by employing the knife as a symbol. The knife does not merely represent a knife. To the farmer's wife, it represents racial superiority, power, and control. To the mice, it represents oppression, violence, and slavery. The knife is quite literally and symbolically carving away the form and future of the mouse. Three Blind Mice not only tells us about slavery, it shows us. The form of the poem subtly encourages us to consider the content by subconsciously interpreting the shape of the poem. The way in which the poem is written is often just as important as what is actually said in words. The shape of the poem is quite symbolic of slavery. The poem is short, symbolic of a shorter lifespan. The poem has a simple and repetitive structure, symbolic of monotonous and demeaning tasks which a slave completes, and the final line is only half the length of the other lines, symbolizing an incomplete existence. Interestingly, the final word used before the shortest line in the poem is the word life. This further helps us to make the connection between the theme, the content, and the form. Because the word life is used just before a symbolic shortening, it appears as though the poet is trying to reinforce the idea that a slave's life, symbolically the last line, is not seen as comparable to a slave owner's life, symbolically all the other lines in the poem. The form of the poem is the physical arrangement of the poem. The unusual and odd shape of the poem is indicative of the unacceptable and inappropriate existence of slavery. While the words themselves hint at the theme of slavery, so too does the form of the Three Blind Mice. Punctuation refers to the marks used to separate sentences and their elements. The mice have quite literally and physically been cut off from their elements. As slaves, were sentenced to a life without freedom. It seems fitting then to end the poem with a punctuation mark that makes one consider the question mark. As an audience, we're being asked a very direct and soul-searching question. Did you ever see such a sight in your life as 3 blind mice? If indeed this poem is an allusion to the slave era in the United States, then perhaps the question more subtly reads, did you ever think that such a thing could have happened? If this is the case, then not only is this poem alluding to such events, but then it is also critiquing and condemning the entire practice of slavery. As the reader, we are then asked to consider all that we know about humanity and ask ourselves whether or not we're surprised that such an atrocity occurred. No longer is the power in the hands of the poet. By asking a question at the end of the poem, we're being asked to make our own judgment. Did you ever see such a sight in your life as 3 blind mice? This essay is hopefully significantly better than the first essay that you saw. There's more organization. There's more direct quoting and referencing. It shows you, on line 5, on line 4. It goes a little bit deeper. It's not just simply what we see on the surface of the poem. It has an idea, and it says, potentially, possibly, this could actually be the theme. Maybe it's not just about mice, because on the surface, the poem is about mice. So if we had a deep interpretation, we wouldn't be interpreting something if we were going to the obvious conclusion that it is about death. So it's offering another possibility, and not necessarily a ludicrous possibility. It would probably be ludicrous to say that the poem, The 3 Blind Mice, was about cotton candy at the fair. That would be a little bit silly. Maybe you could do it. I don't know. I think that'd be silly. One of the other things that this essay does a little bit better than the third one that I showed you guys is that it explains it a little bit better and it justifies it a little bit better. The word choice is higher, better, more effective, whatever you want to say. And the examples are probably a little bit better incorporated into the argument. Now that I've actually read through it again, I would say the conclusion is interesting, but it, probably could summarize a little bit more. But there we are. Hopefully you guys can see the difference between the qualities in levels of the poem, or the essays that were, the 1 out of 4, the 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4, and 4 out of 4. It doesn't mean that at a grade 5 level or an 8 level or a grade 10 level, you have to be writing at the 4 out of 4 level. All I want to do is show you, here's a difference. You've got one poem and you've got 4 different essays analyzing it. Which essay is better than the other one? So there we go. You decide for yourself. Did it feel better? Did it not feel better? I mean, really, what would be worse is if you were like, no, actually, essay 3 was better than essay 4. I don't know. Maybe we have a problem. But there we are. Now you guys can see some differences. Hopefully that helps. And there we go. Thank you.